Good afternoon. You're watching News 9 Live. I'm Shweta Kothari. We here at News 9 are running a pre-budget programming in this very special series called Budget 2024, Blueprint for the Big Leap. All eyes are now on the upcoming announcements of the full budget on 23rd of July by the newly formed NDA government. Indian government is expected to focus on job creation and ensure employment opportunity for the youth. Now, investors and entrepreneurs in India are especially hopeful from the Indian startup sector. They are hoping for greater budgetary allocation and anticipating a favorable business environment with enhanced regulatory and tax measures for startups. Now, given that many startups are facing challenges in raising capital, the upcoming budget is expected to provide some fillip or incentive to investors to support innovative ideas that show clear path to profitability. That is the tagline, of course, clear path to profitability. Now, startups in sectors like deep tech, gaming, fintech and mobility, among others, are especially hopeful of a greater support. To talk about what startup sector is expecting from the budget and what is the startup scenario in India looking like as of this month, joining us is Lloyd Mathias. He's an angel investor. Also with us is Srinath Sridharan, policy researcher. Gentlemen, appreciate you both taking time out. It's been very long since I last spoke to the two of you together. Srinath, I want to come to you first. You know, India is ranked third globally when it comes to unicorns. It has over 110 unicorn startups as of this year, as of March this year. Yet, for some reason, it does feel like this year and since last year that the startup story is tapering down. What exactly is happening?
See, I think unicorns by definition are rare and mysterious and hardly seen, right? I think in the run-up to, I think, calling out that policies have shaped unicorns, I think probably it is true. The reality is, are unicorns being able to scale and deliver profits? Are they profitably serving customers? I think that's a reality check, one. Two, I think what we have also seen in the unicorns very clearly, distinctly three large buckets. One, the financial services, the fintech bucket. The second one has been the consumption bucket or consumption delivery, whether it's Zepto, Swiggy, Zomatos of the world. And third is the other kind of technology startups which are solving for other problems. What is going to be interesting is, can we create unicorns out of the fourth bucket, which is deep tech? And I think that is going to be the larger challenge of it from the ecosystem perspective.
All right. And I'll come to deep tech in just a bit. Let me also get Lloyd into this conversation. Lloyd, you know, I want to set the ball rolling by really understanding how is the startup sector doing. We have over 1.5 lakh registered, recognized startups in this country. Yet for some reason, over a year and a half now, it does look like funding is going slow. Startups are struggling, or at least trying to find that path to profitability. Many well-known startups haven't really been doing too well. What are your big expectations of the budget, and how do you see startup sector flourishing in months to come?
Thank you for having me on the show, Shweta. While it's true that post the peak of, you can say, 2021 and 2022, there has definitely been a slowdown. I think all of that could not really be equated with bad news. In my mind, there was some degree of rationality that was expected to come in that boom phase of startups. When companies got more real, investors got more focused on returns. And therefore, there was a shakeout. To some extent, there's been a slowdown. Even the pace of growth of unicorns, which had reached an all-time high in 2021 and 2022, has obviously dropped down to a trickle. But I would say not all of that is bad news. What is certainly concerning is two aspects. One is that today, a lot of early stage investors are a little bit more tentative when it comes to very early stage investments. One part because they've heard of a lot of startups failing largely. But the bigger concern to my mind is really the fact that, in a sense, a lot of startups went berserk almost in that great period of funding. And a lot of basic issues like governance, putting in proper work practices didn't really work out, right? And that's a big concern for investors. But frankly, a lot of that has not much to do with the expectation of the budget. I think when it comes to the budget, my kind of big three expectations clearly would be extending the tax breaks for early stage investors so that money from domestic investors continues to flow and that buoyancy is maintained. I think that's one area. Two is, and I think Srinath alluded to that briefly, I think it's also to look at certain sectors where India has an inherent advantage. right? If you just look at areas like deep tech, given the technology manpower we have, given that thanks to good digital infra, our fintech has sort of matured quite a bit. I think providing things like AI, I think providing enough incentives specifically to some of those sectors will not only be a fillip to the startup ecosystem, will also, in a sense, help some of India's early stage companies get a global presence, which is badly needed. And my third wish would really be is to kind of help some startups which in the last 5 odd years have domiciled overseas for various reasons.
Okay.
If some of them if they can kind of facilitate a return to the country to the gift city or any such measures, so that we actually have a lot of IP that continues to reside here, as opposed to a lot of it taking flight out of the country.
All right. And, since the two of you mentioned deep tech, and that is one area where there is scope for improvement, I want to come back to you, Srinath. A national deep tech startup policy, the draft for which has been in public for a year now, but we haven't seen much moving. Every other month, we hear talks of government trying to come out with that final policy, and perhaps it will be rolled out in next 2 months. And that has been postponing for a while now. What exactly do you think is happening? What is the impediment?
So I think the reality is in deep tech or be it in AI or what started off 2 years ago as Web3, we have been doing a lot of policy flip-flops. And I think the challenge there is it has to be a very consensus-driven approach, not just from the policy makers or the bureaucrats, but also bringing in the sectoral experts to the academia also. And here is where, as an investor, there's a kind of a challenge that I foresee. Where is the STEM ecosystem in India that says that, for example, if you look at the statistics, we will say that 12% of all STEM graduates in the world are from India. But let's look at the quality of STEM graduates in India. Very, very poor. We have had our ITS majors speak openly about it. So if we really have to create an ecosystem of deep tech, I think it has to be larger than life blueprint that we will need, not just about tax breaks or any of those incentives for investors. Investors will always go for two aspects. One, where there is a least resistance path for their capital, and two, human capital. So in the deep tech space, I think human capital, whether it's deep tech and including the AI and the quantum computing in that ecosystem, we are going to have a challenge. How many intellectual properties or trademarks or patents does India have? How many research papers get written? If you just simply Google deep tech academic papers, China probably has 32% of all the academic research papers published and peer-reviewed. India doesn't have much at all. So I think these are also learnings. If we want large investors to come in, it's not just only about ideas, but again, how do we create an ecosystem? I think that's where the largest challenge is.
All right, an ecosystem that allows for research to flourish, an ecosystem that allows for deep tech companies to set shop in India, to make inroads into India. Now, there was a recent report that came out suggesting that about 77% of all Indian startups are actually investing in AI, machine learning, Internet of Things, and blockchain, among others. Lloyd, do you think there is a conducive environment today for allowing these companies to keep flourishing in India? What sort of change in ecosystem are you looking at? Do you envision for the next 1 year or so?
Shweta, I'd take that 77% number with a pinch of salt. And the reason I say so is that startups are pretty nimble, right? So when the flavor of the season is about AI and deep tech, a lot of them manage to kind of find a reasonable way. Today, almost any technology-based startup involves some degree of AI at some level. So I would really like to kind of look at that number in depth to understand what extent there's genuine kind of deep tech or, in that context. And that's one part. Okay. But I would also say that the government has to play an enabling role. As Srinath rightly pointed out, investors will flock where they see least friction to their money and better chance of return, but also the ability of technology that became sustainable. What we did see, and to loosely use an example of what happened to just replicating global technologies in India in a Me Too context without adequate customization or based on real-time consumer insights in India is always going to flounder. And in fact, given the complexity in this country, given the sheer diversity of the country, they actually stand a much better chance when it comes to technology and indeed deep tech-based startups can perfect their craft, so to speak, on a very diverse customer base here and actually be a springboard to actually take to a lot of global markets, specifically the developing markets,
Okay.
given that our digital infrastructure has become robust. So I think the government has to play a big enabling role in actually helping Indian companies, not all of them in the early stage, but some, let's say, more matured startups, actually take those few steps overseas. So India's startup ecosystem stops just being a domestic counting number of unicorn story, but more becomes a kind of large scale global play.
All right. And you know, apart from focusing on emerging sectors, that of course we're hoping Budget 2024 will focus on, the other expectation is of course simplification of taxation. One of the things that we often talk about, Lloyd and Srinath, when we are discussing startups is the angel tax story, which is when things get murkier. We know, I think all of us agree on, that startups need quick money. They need money and capital flowing all the time. And if they have to part way with a large section or large part of that capital in form of an income tax, that hampers their ability to grow at a rate they want to. I want to, ask you, Lloyd, at this point, do you think it's about time that angel tax must go away?
I think so. I certainly think it should. That's one case. But I would also like to add two things. I think one, there's a much bigger role for expanding government-backed venture funds. I think right now, India is a very, very marginal player in that. Secondly, I think simplifying foreign investment regulations into the startup ecosystem, right? Again, there are too many hurdles right now, right? The government, I know, created a corpus of 945 crores in April 2021, which is scheduled to end, I think, early 2025. So
Right.
clearly you need some announcement there. The other, at a more simplistic level, is back to the old famed term of ease of doing business. How do you streamline a lot of regulatory approvals so startups focus on what they do best and not spend a lot of time building an overlay of regulatory experts and spend a lot of their time and efforts actually navigating the ecosystem? I think, again, simplicity through, incubation labs which are technology oriented, I think that would make a significant difference.
All right. It's been about 10 years since Modi government first came out with those jargons called Make in India, cutting the red tape. Srinath, in context of startups, have we got there, or how far are we rather? I think the right question to ask should be, how far are we from actually cutting the red tape? How far are we from simplifying taxation? Because as I mentioned, angel tax, which many people in observers, experts in startup, they call it retrograde. They say that it really is difficult. It really makes us ineligible to spend the money that we are raising to the best of its capacity. What are your expectations as far as taxation is concerned?
Yeah, I think death and tax are both inevitable. So for a sector to continuously bombard with the messaging that you need to do away with taxation, yes, I mean, that's what their public lobbies are paid for. Angel tax must go, and of course, the prudential aspect of whatever income tax or let's say capital gains can be brought in. But the reality is, from red tapeism point of view, if you look at the last 10 years, a lot of those simplification of tax forms or returns have happened. But I think the larger reform, which I'm hoping that the third regime of the Modi government will do, is simply simplifying direct taxation code, not just for investments overall, and that will probably form a sub part of it. The second aspect of this entire taxation is how soon do people want to repatriate money back? I mean, it's very simple, right? I'm bringing in a foreign investor, and when I make a profit, can I get the money out of India on time, every time, with the least taxable possible? Yes, I think that also forms part of ease of doing business in India. And that's something that we've been very slow. While we kind of use unicorns as a calling card for India, we kind of use the finishing tape as the goalpost. We forgot that there is a red tape behind it. And that's something that we need to simplify further. And here, I slightly differ from Lloyd. I think government should not be investing in a risk capital called angel investing or venture capital. That's not government's business at all. And I think it should stay away.
Do you not agree that the Startup India Seed Fund scheme may need a top-up this time around?
I mean, you top it up. I mean, the fact is, all your unicorns, the bulk of the businesses have not come from any of those ventures. The reality is the market, the private market, or the private capital has actually funded it. And that's what has grown. So putting a kind of a red tape around anything that is government funded or government backed comes with its own set of constraints and challenges. Move away from it. I mean, if government really wants to do it, almost like NIIF, can they put a fund and say, let market run it, and we're also participating along with a market fund rather than being it a government fund? I mean, that's my concern with anything that's a risk capital.
All right. And, gentlemen, before I close the show, I think it's important to also mention a couple of things that you talked about. And Lloyd, going back to you, I think one of the takeaways from a conversation that I've been having with a lot of people is that there is also a need for bringing some of these, startups really back to India. The onshoring of these rather than offshoring of some of these startups. That's been a conversation that ministers have also had previously as to how do you really ensure there is no flight of capital? How do you really ensure that many of these startups continue to sustain in India? They don't move out as far as not just their corporate offices, but entirety of their operation is concerned. And, there is a division there of thought. A lot of people believe that if it were to be easy to continue business in India, we would remain invested in India. But because the taxation system is so complex and you need to have approvals on approvals, it's easier, therefore, to move offshore to other South Asian countries and set shop and set up corporate offices there. Do you believe at this point government has done enough to bring some of these startups back to India? There is a conducive, favorable environment?
Clearly, Shweta, not enough has been done. But
Okay.
offshoring happens on the back of two things. I think the first, like you rightly pointed out, is ease of doing business. The fact that getting things done here is not always very easy. The second, and far more important, and at least in the case of startups that I have seen, is a lot of them find being headquartered outside of the country, whether it's Southeast Asia, Singapore, or ideally the Silicon Valley, as a much easier way to attract funding. Secondly, they also, being based there, are able to access international markets where your margins, specifically for any service business, tends to be much better than serving an India-only client base. So setting up internationally gives you an international footprint. It gives you the ability to reach out to international customers and improves your ability to fund dramatically. Right now, all of this, very difficult to reverse this trend. So I think with new instruments like the Gift City, I think a lot of the financial burden of having a company domiciled in India and not able to attract foreign funding, I think that can lower itself significantly. So I really think that ideas like the Gift City should really have a component where startups can be housed, which then makes it much easier for foreign funding to both come into the country for the startup ecosystem and make it much easier addressing the issue of repatriation, which is one big important aspect why early stage investors have a little tentativeness, specifically international investors, on involving with Indian startups.
Absolutely. And I think one of the questions and one of the concerns, Srinath, we've also been discussing during the year is that it's not just the flight of capital that one is worried about, it's also the brain drain, of course, and the fact that India is losing a lot of its startup ideas to a lot of other foreign countries. It's time to bring them back, to bring them on shore. Now, that, of course, will be in line and in tandem with greater startup policy that India will envisage. But another concern area for India right now is job creation. India doesn't have enough jobs. It needs more jobs. It needs about 12 to 20 million more jobs, and startups could just be the right place to fund in order to spur that job growth, if at all. In your assessment, before I let you go, your final thoughts on what are your expectations as far as startup ecosystem in India is concerned? How do you really kick it start from 2022, where India saw a lot more number of unicorns, to today, where just 3 unicorns have been registered so far? How do you really kickstart India's startup story?
Yeah, I think if I have to blend the two questions of startups and linking it to unemployment or employment numbers, I don't think startups were originally put together to generate employment. That's the reality of it. I mean, it disintermediates a lot of things. And the very fact that most of our unicorns are disintermediators. They're not actually mediators adding a layer of human value to it. So which means that expecting startups to create a large employment base is a sense of fallacy. I think that we'll have to accept that. I mean, just because, let's say, you have a platform like a Swiggy or a Zomato which employs humans, it doesn't mean everybody else would do. A fintech platform will actually kill probably 20,000 jobs in the banking sector.
Just a quick follow-up on that. There is an understanding here that a lot of common people have is that don't be a job seeker, be a job creator. Even if you're employing two people, at least you're employing somebody and you're being employed in the process as opposed to being somebody who's actively looking out for a job. Do you not agree with that analogy?
I don't, Shweta, there's a living example, right? 6.5 crore Indians are what I call as nano SMEs. They employ 1.5 to 2 people each. They are single mom and pop shop owners, 6.5 crores, one of the largest employer in the country. And currently we bucket them under MSME, and we know the struggles that they've been going through, right? They're still in the informal sector. They don't get access to credit and all that. So unless we can solve for things like that, I mean, what are we going to solve in the overall tech startups? Just because somebody is saying, I'm speaking to others on the phone or on a digital platform? Not really. So I think startups are not going to solve for employment problem or livelihood problem. And here is where I think in one of the future conversations we're going to have is, does creator economy actually have a future? And I think startups should start about it.
Okay, you're not going to make a lot of YouTubers happy with that comment, but Lloyd Mathias, before I let you go, your big expectations from Indian startup ecosystem and the budget, of course. How does budget really kick off and kickstart startup story for India?
Yeah, I think the first budget of a new government, I think always tends to kind of raise the morale and the mood. And given the fact that effectively over the last 6 months, since the so-called interim budget that happened earlier in the year, I think this kind of is able to draw a new slate altogether. Now, albeit for the first time in 10 years, we're in a coalition setup, I do expect a lot more fresh thought, something that would address the issue, and Srinath briefly alluded, the fact that unemployment seems to be a serious issue. So which are the areas which, some focus on the MSME or the SME sector in terms of easing credit, I think that's required. Because what happens is with, let's say better employment further down the pyramid, I think it can give a larger fillip to the entire ecosystem. So I would say that has to remain the budget's primary focus. I think that has to be the big driver. And secondly, specifically in the context of startups, I think clearly far more transparency, much easier way of funding, making the whole, extending the tax holiday, I certainly second that. That's one area. And as much as Srinath and I differ, I think government has to play an enabler into whatever extent it can. May not necessarily be financial, I recognize that. But somewhere along, I think in a sense, this government in its previous avatar, in the first 2 avatars, certainly built up the whole startup ecosystem. Being in startups became cool, became acceptable. It was no longer, unusual for top business schools, top engineering schools, graduates to get started with startups. I think that continues to maintain. We need to keep that momentum going.
All right. I think we need to keep that momentum going, and Stand Up India, Startup India, which was one of the first mottos of this government, will definitely require greater thrust. It will require greater spotlight, at least in Budget 2024. Srinath Sridharan, Lloyd Mathias, thank you very much, gentlemen, for taking time out for joining us on this very special show. We are, of course, covering all aspects of Budget 2024 blueprint for the next big leap. Will this budget provide the much needed relief and much needed help for India's startup story? We'll of course have to wait till 23rd of July to know more. And with that, we've completely run out of time. Thank you very much for watching.